Good morning, everyone. Joining us are some people from the US here, so that's good evening to all our US-based attendees and including some of our panelists. We're here to talk about imagining a Biden presidency. This is hosted by Manila House in partnership with Asia Society Philippines. Just a shout out to our Asia Society colleagues. Thank you, Joy Alampay, for partnering with us on this, for this event. Now we have a very exciting election season coming up. It's more chaotic than usual, but we know that the Trump presidency was not a normal presidency to begin with. And we know that one of the biggest issues is the COVID crisis, and there's a spanner that's been thrown into the works now with President Trump himself being diagnosed with COVID and being hospitalized. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Bambina Olivares. I'm the Director of Programming at Manila House. It's very nice to see a lot of members with us right now, including one of our co-panelists today, Victor Manhit, more popularly known as Dindo. Yeah. Okay, before we start, so I'd like to just give a brief introduction to all our speakers. I'll begin with, we have joining us today are Harry Thomas Jr., who used to be an ambassador to the Philippines. He was in the Philippines from 2010 to 2013, and he's had a long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service. He retired in March 2018 with the rank of Career Minister after more than 3 decades in the Foreign Service. Ambassador Thomas also served as Executive Secretary and Special Assistant to Secretary Rice, Director General of the Foreign Service, Director for South Asia at the National Security Council, and Director of the Operations Center. Joining us as well is Lila Shahani, who is a former Secretary General of the UNESCO National Commission of the Philippines. She's also had a distinguished career in civil service and the Foreign Service as well. During the Aquino administration, she was Assistant Secretary and Head of Communications of the Human Development and Poverty Reduction Cabinet Cluster, which covered 26 Philippine government agencies dealing with poverty and development. She was also spokesperson of the Intra-Agency Council Against Human Trafficking. Prior to this, she was Assistant Secretary and Head of Communications of the National Anti-Poverty Commission. Lila is now based in Seattle. She's working on her doctorate. Am I right? Yeah, she's a doctoral candidate at Oxford University. And she is actually actively campaigning with the Biden-Harris campaign among the Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders community in the US. Cindy Domingo joins us as well. Hi, Lila. Cindy joins us as well from the US. She is affiliated with Akbayan North America and has been doing Philippine solidarity work for over 45 years. Cindy became active around the Philippines during the years of the Marcos dictatorship and was a member of the US-based organization, Union of Democratic Filipinos. As a result of their work in the anti-Marcos movement, Cindy's brother, Silma Domingo, and fellow trade union officer, Jen Viernes, were murdered in their Seattle Union Hall of the Alaska Cannery Workers Union in 1981. Cindy actually led the successful effort to win justice in the murders that won a landmark civil suit in 1989 against the Marcoses in the murders of her brother and Viernes, and won a judgment of $23.5 million for their families. This is the only time a foreign dictator has been liable for murders of 2 US citizens. She's also been in government for 26 years as Chief of Staff to a county council member. She co-edited the book A Time to Rise, Collective Memoirs of the Union of Democratic Filipinos, and contributed to Women Against Marcos, Stories of Filipinos and Filipino-American Women Who Fought the Dictator. Again, she's based in Seattle and also actively campaigning for the Biden-Harris ticket among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in America. Lisa Pagkalinawan is the chair of Democrats Abroad Philippines, which is the official arm of the Democratic Party for Americans living outside the United States. She helped form the Philippine chapter in 2007 and has actively been helping Americans vote by absentee ballot. She's a senior environmental expert with over 28 years of professional experience in the Philippines and other Asian countries. She's currently a consultant to the Asian Development Bank. She's certified as qualified environmental professional by the Institute of Professional Environmental Practice and has a master's degree in environmental management from Yale University. Now, all the previous speakers are Democrats, I think, or Democrat affiliated. And now we go to Dindo Manhit, who is an independent analyst. Professor Dindo Manhit is the founder and managing director of the Stratbase Group and president of its policy think tank, Albert Del Rosario Institute for Strategic and International Studies, or the ADRI. For more than a decade, Professor Manhit and the Stratbase team have been developing innovative and disruptive political and legislative strategies that position clients for success. A well-regarded strategist, he has built winning public affairs campaigns, integrating message development, public relations, and the mobilization of grassroots support. With his extensive experience, he helps clients understand the interplay between business and government and the impact of legislative, regulatory, and electoral outcomes on their business strategies. He also provides top-level strategic analysis and thought leadership on global issues in the Philippines. So before we begin, I'd like to again welcome everyone. I feel a little bit like Nicole Wallace of MSNBC, welcoming friends and who've been here before, specifically Ambassador Thomas and Lila, who've joined us in the past. And now we welcome all our panelists, and we're in for a very exciting discussion, I think. We'll start with Dindo's presentation. He has a presentation for us explaining all the possible scenarios and the possible impact of a democratic administration on the Philippines and Southeast Asian relations, or relations in the Asia-Pacific region. And then we'll start a discussion, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll get to you. So Dindo, I yield to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Bambina. Sharing my slide now. Good morning to everyone, and good evening to some participants and even our esteemed speakers. Allow me to share some slides in the next few minutes. And I wanted to start with a quote that I came across more than a year ago, still during the Democratic primaries, whereby I saw this line from Vice President Biden, whereby he spoke of no country, even one as powerful as ours, can go at it alone against challenges that respect no borders and cannot be contained by walls. We need to look for opportunities to strengthen cooperation with democratic friends and to fortify our collective capabilities. I wanted to start with this one because it reflects really the challenge of the United States, not only in a region, but in a global setting, especially as we move into really a multipolar world, that it cannot really be centered on what the United States want or some other powers. And going deeper into Vice President Biden's plan, I wanted to share some of the thoughts that has been posted in some of their campaign sites. It speaks of the VP Biden's foreign policy. Number one focuses on an important value, which is reinvigorating democracy. And within that is a component, I think there's a three component to it, the renewed economic security, and how do they plan to fight global threats. Along that line are specifics. It speaks of corruption and authoritarianism, human rights violations. It speaks of democracy as core to alliances for the United States, and of course, maintaining a free world order. On the economic side, it's about economic practices and policies with democratic values, securing the fifth domain that focuses on the challenges of cybersecurity and the evolving national and global security threat. On the third point, I take note of, it goes beyond maintaining the free order toward the free world, but elevating the relevance of international organizations. Diplomacy and partnerships are very important, and ending forever wars and fighting the climate crisis. When I came across this core values or core points, it reminded me of things that we track in the ADR Institute. we try to track for the past decade regional security challenges. And normally we focus on traditional challenges. But of course, this pandemic and the rise of climate concern introduced us to non-traditional security environment. And with technologies, I would focus on emerging security threats, how that would relate to possible policy initiatives of a Biden presidency. So more than security, traditional military issues like maritime and territorial integrity, institutional cohesion and coordination among states, or geopolitical security architecture. This global pandemic brings to us the issue of health and pandemic as an issue within the security sphere, or issues of climate change, or even the economic consequences of climate change and the health crisis. But now, as the country moves towards digital transformation, there are some threats with regards to digital transformation. Issues of hybrid warfare and digital technologies, or even sharp power threats, will continue to be challenging to small countries like the Philippines. And where does the United States play that role? But before we go into that, I wanted to share something that I wrote a few weeks back in the Philippine Daily Inquirer. At the core of the security challenge of the Philippines is China. China's emergence as a political and economic power has come with growing ambitions as it attempts to position itself as a global leader and shape the international order, especially in our region, the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific region. Its rise, I believe, is far from peaceful, with its questionable economic initiatives and aggression in the West Philippine Sea. Given the critical juncture that China is in today, its foreign policy direction will dictate the country's global standing in the coming years. And I'd like to relate this to my further discussion about imagining the Biden presidency in the region. I believe the Biden presidency needs to accept that the US moves around in a multipolar world, that they cannot be at the center of global challenges. They need to regain trust and confidence among regional allies. The narrative that has been shared by our own government, the Philippine government, for those who have advocated stronger relationship with China, was that you cannot trust the US. So they need to regain trust and confidence. And part of that is acceptance that the center of geo-economic and geopolitical shift could be the Indo-Pacific region. And a key aspect for US engagement must therefore be built on understanding the domestic and the region-specific characteristics and development happening within the Indo-Pacific region. My second point about the multipolar world is that this US-China strategic competition cannot remain on a deadlock of polarizing acts. We want US leadership that must establish common goals in maintaining regional peace and stability within the principles of democratic values. That alone makes the US role in the region very important. We share values, and part of that democratic values, key to that is maintaining a rule-based order. So we need a Biden presidency to shift away from this great power politicking. That in the region, it's not about US against China or China against the US. The uncertainty of the global order is heavily influenced by the unique characteristics of China's rise. Its calculative approach in navigating to the current order bears the nature of hybrid tactics, whereby China has exploited vulnerabilities through strategic and opportunistic employment of its power and influence in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region. The excessive focus placed on this strategic competition between the US and China has undermined the role of other states in the region. And if we will speak of the rise of democratic values, we need to consider the middle or smaller powers whose stake and interests are just as substantial. the Indo-Pacific states have an equal, if not greater, impact on how the regional order should be shaped because it affects their neighborhood, it affects their area. And I'd like to introduce the idea of minilateralism, the need for participation engagement that can be led by a Biden presidency. The inherent multipolarity of the Indo-Pacific region has produced complex issues that can only be addressed through the participation of directly affected states. And focus on that, as an example, is the South China Sea. Maybe it's time to go beyond ASEAN and to look at ASEAN minus X. If we cannot have other ASEAN countries or beholden to China economically to support our desire for protection of maritime rights and territorial integrity within a rule-based order, then we should go beyond ASEAN and build one which they call the ASEAN minus X. Or just this week, we hear of the meeting of the Quad security dialogue in Tokyo. Of course, I think through video calls, but you see the Quad representing the US, Australia, Japan, and India. When you imagine the geography of these countries, imagine that the Philippines is in the middle of those countries. So a minilateral collaboration would strengthen the importance of a rule-based order. So to sum it up, I believe a Biden presidency should take some of these key actions in the Indo-Pacific region. Their leadership remains crucial with the rise of evolving security threats in both traditional, non-traditional, or even emerging spaces. However, US cannot undermine the role and participation of smaller or middle powers in this transitory phase for global order. So to be more specific, I could speak of a Biden foreign policy should be forward-looking rather than trying to regain a global order that has passed, whereby at the center of it is the United States. With COVID-19, a global economic crisis, a fast-paced digitization, and a growing threat to democracy, adopting new strategies or recalibrating existing ones are crucial to address these security threats. Second point, as such, US must utilize effective minilateral coalitions. They need to build on ASEAN support. They need to build on support coming from other nations within the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific or the East Asia-Pacific area, and build on one that can have shared values of rule-based and democratic values. And last point, as a global institutions and organizations such as the United Nations, they must elevate its relevance to the changing political, economic, and security environment on this new world order. I'll leave it with that. I hope it could trigger some discussions. Thank you, and good morning and good evening to everyone again.
Thank you so much, Dindo, for that. I think that's given us a great overview of the challenges facing the Biden presidency in this region. I think let's start the discussion on, first of all, let's talk about COVID now. COVID is now, kind of omnipresent. And the response of the Trump administration to the COVID crisis has been, I think, the defining failure of the Trump administration. And it will be the immediate challenge of a Biden administration if they were to come in. Now, how do you think the Biden and Harris becoming president, vice president, how will that all change now that they will make COVID the COVID response a priority? You can unmute.
Right.
Yeah, and Cindy, you were saying earlier that this would actually have an impact on the Philippines as well.
Right? Yeah, the Trump administration antagonized the whole world and only furthered his position first of ignoring COVID and saying it didn't really exist, instead of taking the position that a pandemic in itself is global. and we need a global solution, and that we need to look at partners all over the world in order for us to overcome the greatest economic world crisis that we're facing, in order to find a vaccine that will resolve this particular pandemic. Trump has completely ignored and said that the COVID does not exist until now that he has caught it. And so this will be the greatest challenge for Biden, because Trump's position only reflects everything that's wrong with Trump. No one can trust him. He's a bully. And he used the COVID crisis as a way to continue to attack China and further isolate the United States around the world. And so Joe Biden is going to have to, as Victor said, he's going to have to establish internationally, not only in Asia, but internationally, trust amongst stations to become the moral leader that this country needs, and to be able to bring countries together, as well as his own country, in order to deal with the crisis. He's going to have to rejoin the World Health Organization. He's going to have to rejoin the United Nations. He's going to have to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. All of those are necessary to reestablish the United States' position in the world, and to reestablish trust that is going to be needed to fight this pandemic economically, socially, medically. So that's why Biden and Harris is going to be important to elect them, not only for the United States, but internationally.
Want to add anything to that? But he has said, though, Biden has said that he will rejoin the Paris Agreement, and
Yes.
he'll renew all the other international accords. Yes, Lila. Lila, can you unmute?
Yes, hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you, Dindo and Cindy and Bambina. I just wanted to address the points that you, Bambina, brought up in the larger context of what Dindo and Cindy have been saying, which is that, you know, COVID is a global phenomenon. It's a transnational phenomenon. And part of the policy problem is that Trump is decidedly anti-multilateralist. And I say this in the larger continuum of US foreign policy beyond Trump. I mean, to be fair, the US has been notorious in not being a part of so many of the Bretton Woods institutions. I mean, it has not signed and ratified many UN conventions. So it's not just Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Status of the Child, et cetera, but I mean, today you have the sort of pull out of UNESCO and WHO, decreased funding for the Secretariat at the UN in general. So while the US has I mean, even with regard to the Rome Statute in the International Criminal Court, the US does not want to be bound by those things. On the other hand, one of the reasons why I really strongly, deeply respect Joe Biden is because he is self-avowedly a multilateralist. And, you know, Dindo is absolutely right. I mean, he says, you know, well, America has to get out of its hubris just as China does, and, you know, get out of this great power discourse. But I must say that one thing I learned in graduate school and at working in the UN is that countries will only do things that are in their economic and strategic interests. And so to sort of invoke a kind of common humanity is wonderful, but then at the end, stripped of all these foibles and embellishments, when it gets down to the brass tacks of realpolitik, countries are going to do what puts them in the greatest position of power. So that's the reality. And China's going to do it. And Dennis Youngblood is absolutely correct when he says, well, you know, one of the persons in the chat who says, well, you know, if China does not want to be a part of these mechanisms, how do we hold them accountable? I think that Trump wanting, you know, saying denigrating remarks, not just about the WHO, but NATO pulling out of things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Obama began, which had its own problems, but you know, it was a way of consolidating U.S. power in different regions. But the point I'm making is that at least with Joe Biden, A, you have a respect for science. B, you have an adherence to what those scientists recommend. And C, you have a relative humility with respect to America's position vis-a-vis the rest of the entire world. Thanks.
Harry, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I take a little bit of a different track, although I very much agree with Dindo with his comments. My point, however, is that the United States and the world has to prepare. In previous pandemics, for example, Ebola, President Obama mobilized the United Nations, WHO, used the United States military, Africa Command, European Command, and the 101st Airborne. The greatest skills of the US military is not warfighting, it's logistics. So when you use the great logistics that our military has, that frees the scientists and doctors to treat, experiment. This will be experimental treatment, clearly. People, I would hope that if Vice President Biden's elected, he would mobilize our military along with NATO and other militaries to do the same thing that's been done in the past. That can be done. But as Mr. Youngblood said, Dr. Youngblood said, this cost will be staggering. So what is the Philippines prepared to do? Because if a vaccine is found, let's be clear, the wealthy countries are going to get it for their citizens first. And the countries who are depending on aid are going to get it last. That may be right, that may be wrong, but this is a fact. So what is the Philippines doing now to try to prepare for obtaining, selling, finding the vaccine, work with other developing countries to purchase it, just depending on the US to distribute the vaccine as an aid-dependent country would be a major mistake. We know that if a vaccine is found, despite what President Trump says, it could take up to a year just to give those shots to all Americans. Clearly, just treating Americans is a wrong policy. We understand that, but it's a staggering cost. So how does the Philippines getting in line? Is the Philippines going to purchase? Does the Philippines have supply chain lines ready? So what is the Philippines doing to prepare to get these drugs to its people as quickly as possible? Just depending on the old, the US is going to give it to you, or the new, you think China's going to give it to you, to me would be a mistake. Yeah.
But you bring up now, you said something about the deployment of the military. So can we like pivot a bit to defense? And Biden, I think, has committed to spend less for defense and more on other programs. Am I right? And how does that affect the situation in the South China Sea, realistically speaking?
Well, we spend $800 billion on defense a year. I don't know, first of all, he doesn't control all of that. Even with President Trump, when he's trying to cut aid to certain parts, the legislatures put money back. So we would have to see. The Western Philippine Sea, under President Obama and Vice President Biden, we put over 60% of our military assets in Indo-Pacific. Those are there even more. So the question is, how do you increase collaboration? Whether we like it or not, President Trump has actually initially increased foreign aid and military aid to the Philippines before drastically cutting it, although Philippines remains the #1 recipient in Southeast Asia. So how do you make this, how do you come to peaceful agreements with China? Is continue to talk, continue to use ASEAN. One of the frustrations we had when I was there is ASEAN didn't have a common position because they disagreed on who has rights to the Western Philippine Sea. So it's easy for China to pick you off. So until and unless ASEAN comes to an agreement, it's going to be difficult. Philippines also, are you going to just rely on the United States for assistance? Or are you going to build up your military? That is not my call, but those are decisions that have to be made, and a very difficult decision in a developing nation with an uneven economy.
Oh, that also brings up another thing. If Biden becomes president, he also has to deal with the last 2 years or last year and a half of a Duterte administration. Okay, we're all speculating here, but considering the bit of antagonism that that Duterte had for Obama, or that he expressed towards Obama when he first became president, how would he react to a Biden presidency, do you think? Lila, unmute, please.
Hi, I don't mean to hop the conversation. I know Lisa hasn't said anything yet, but I think someone in the chat, in the question and answer section, asked a really good question. They were anonymous, but they said there seems to be some tension between the Biden campaign's emphasis on human rights and its intention to strengthen partnerships in the region, blah, 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 right? And I think, what's very noticeable about ASEAN is that they have this kind of Westphalian idea that they're not going to interfere in each other's domestic issues. So it's this kind of, kumbaya, let's hold hands and, let's do economic, cultural exchange, which is not necessarily a bad thing. In contrast, in the UN, there is this kind of, well, if you are a part of this institution, then other members have the right to call you on certain things that we consider to be problematic. I think Biden cannot have not learned from the Obama-Duterte conflict when, Duterte was very disparaging when he called him on human rights. That being said, I think he may not call him out so openly, but what I like about the Democrats is that they are irrevocably and unconditionally, they have expressed a commitment to human rights. Now, the one thing I want to say is that the architecture of human rights the world over has really changed in the past few decades, and it's noticeable. Years ago it was political and civil rights, and now we're moving more into economic rights. And it's like a lot of countries, the EU, even the UN, they don't necessarily, they feel comfortable talking about things like torture the way they used to. So it's a worrisome time in history. And I think if we want to protect the Philippines from excesses, human rights excesses, I think a Biden presidency would be much better for us, although I'm not sure that Duterte would be very happy with that. Thanks.
Lisa, can I ask you now, you've been here for some years now and you're the head of Democrats Abroad. How has a Democratic administration, what has it usually meant for the Philippines in your experience?
Well, I think in general, what Biden will bring back is more of a multilateral approach, like was mentioned earlier, and more of respect for other countries and engagement with other countries. Going back to the point Lila was making, maybe engaging the UN more in terms of bringing up some of the human rights issues might be more fruitful. We saw that recently when the EU countries brought up a resolution, and Duterte's response was a little more positive than some of his responses in the past. So maybe that's a way that we could go forward with that.
What about in terms of immigration and trade? Maybe, Dindo, do you want to make a comment about the trade relations between the US and the Philippines? Is there any difference? Do you see any difference between a Democratic administration and a Republican one?
Of course, I've put it in the context of past 4 years. Exactly October 2016, our President Duterte, spoke of his independent foreign policy. And they have used this as a foundation of this idea that we trade more with China. But in reality, what we have with China, and this government data reflects this, is that we import more, which is actually not good. But when we speak of balance of trade, import and export, Japan and the US continues to be our top trading partners. And I believe a Republican or a Democratic government in the United States would continue to be a good trading partner for the Philippines. But as I've said, I put value on the idea that as President Trump maybe took a back step, speaking of internal politics in the US, we lost this opportunity that the US can really be a champion of regional trade when they step out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's good that Japan took over and transformed it in a comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So we just hope that a Biden presidency gets to lead again from that point of view, as a global economic power, and how to bring like-minded countries with shared democratic values who believe on rules to work together for a more open trade and global environment.
What are the obstacles you'd see? Oh, sorry, Lisa, please. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
I was just going to talk about immigration, just in terms of the family-based immigration, I think is really important for Filipinos. There are so many Filipino Americans who petition their family members from the Philippines, and Trump has been trying to stop that and turn more towards merit-based immigration, and also just slowing down or stopping immigration as much as he can. So I think that's one thing that we can look forward to with the Biden presidency, is restoration of family-based immigration and more of an open approach. A lot of the Republicans are anti-immigration because they think it's bad for the economy. And all the studies that I've read show that it's actually good for the economy. Immigrants aren't taking away jobs from Americans who want them. In almost all cases, they pay taxes and they actually boost the economy. So I think in terms of, the global economy always does better when the US economy is doing well. So I think that's something that the Philippines be in favor of. And then also just personal reasons for improved immigration policies.
But I think also historically and, sorry, I was just going to say historically and empirically, the US economy has fared better under Democratic administrations than under.
Yeah, the Republicans always say that they're focused on the economy.
Fiscal conservatism and
right, but so much of what Trump has been doing has actually been hurting the economy. Almost any issue you look at, it's actually hurting the US economy.
And hurting working class people.
Yes.
I mean, I think the whole revamping of the tax system did not benefit working people. It benefited Trump's, friends.
The 1%.
So it's the 1%, and the gap between the rich and the poor got wider and wider. I wanted to just add on to the immigration issue, because I think there's 2 points. One, you're right, I agree with Lisa, that we need to go back to the whole, in the 60s, the whole immigration reform went to a unification of family and away from the quota system. Trump went away from that and went back to the quota system, in which family members had to be put into the quota system. And Biden and Harris have promised that they will go back to unification. Mm-hmm. It's also important that Biden has said that he will go back to a system in which employment base is important. I mean, we see in the United States that Filipino nurses are an essential part of the healthcare system, especially in this fight against COVID. It's Filipino nurses in California alone are 20% of the nursing staff. And yet 70% of the nurses that have died while serving COVID patients, 70% are Filipino. And nationwide, it is 4% of nurses are Filipinos, and 31.5% of the healthcare workers, nurses, have died. They are Filipino. So Filipino nurses are an important part. And in December, they are estimating that 2,900 deaths a day will occur in the United States. How much more we need Filipino healthcare workers. And in nursing homes, they also are disproportionately represented in the nursing homes in the United States. We need the Filipino healthcare workers in this country.
Yes, Lila. Yeah, can you unmute?
I'd like to address both trade and immigration. I agree completely with everything Cindy has said, so I'm not even gonna go there. But about trade between China and the Philippines, to expand upon what Dindo was saying, if you look at all the data on the Belt and Road Initiative, it's obvious Chinese expansionism, but it has led to a debt trap for so many countries. Now, if you read the Department of Foreign Affairs website in the Philippines, it'll say, Belt and Road is fantastic, it's really great. And anyway, we're getting 80% of the money from local sources, the borrowing, and it's only 20% that is coming from abroad, like China, okay? I think that is an important point, and we have to be balanced. But what I have observed is that it's like build, which is great. I mean, why would you not want to build, right? Because if it's going to provide jobs, if it's going to, improve the unemployment rate, great. On the other hand, if there are no environmental controls, and if there are no heritage controls, cultural controls, it can be a disaster, as I experienced when I was with UNESCO. So I think, and build for whom? It's like what Celia Reyes of the Philippine with PIDS was saying at NEDA, that if the growth only, yes, you have a lot of growth, but it only goes to the corporate elite and well-off households. So, I mean, building what? Infrastructure for whom? And who is displaced by this big infra? So that's an important point. Now, trade in America, what I have observed about Joe Biden's policy statements is that he's pretty much said that he doesn't want to get into any major new trade deals in the context of COVID. And he really wants to focus on domestic stimulus for now. Okay, so I mean, that's the first thing. About immigration, initially I was critical of the Biden platform vis-a-vis race and immigration because it read like, you know, Obama, Biden warmed over in the beginning. But then, you know, a lot of us, you know, wrote headquarters and there was a lot of debate. And I'm really happy to see that when it comes to immigration, the Biden-Harris campaign is not just about political representation and affirmative action, but it's about economic empowerment for small businesses, you know, mom and pop, you know, Asian American, Latino American, African American, supporting that kind of thing. And I think that, and also looking at health inequalities in the context of migrants who suffer the most. And so I think that it's far more long-term in its vision, because it's not, I mean, in retrospect, having gone to college, you know, here in the States in the late 80s, I remember we're all talking about affirmative action, and then it failed in so many ways. And now I realize that in large part it was because they did not put an economic undergirding to the idea of political representation. So I think that with respect to both trade and immigration, I think that they're on a better track. Thanks.
I think Biden actually spoke about that in his, he was in Miami, right? And he was talking to the Haitian community and all, and he emphasized those things, building up small businesses again and recovery and all that. So, I mean, it's clear that it's a focus of his administration, but Harry, I think you wanted to say something earlier.
Yeah, thank you. Just a few things. One, you know, tactical. I see my good friend Cuya Cesar Parissimus on, so I would ask him, why not look for the Philippines to be one of the alternative supply chain lines? Right now, Trump and everybody else failed because the just-in-time delivery supply chain was not only, but major part from China. Why doesn't the Philippines offer itself, especially given the ports you have, as an alternative supply chain? You know, that's just a recommendation, a question, not my decision, Dindo. But I would hope that would be something that people would think about.
Dindo?
Yeah, it's adding up to what Ambassador Harry mentioned, is that something that even the Philippine government, or beyond the 2 years of Duterte, should look at also, is that within the region, there's this growing desire to move south. I'm referring to like the new southern policy of the Republic of Korea. There's actually a conference now at this moment. I was a speaker last year, whereby they launched a southern policy for ASEAN. And their biggest trading partner is China, but because of these geopolitical and geosecurity issues, they'd like to look at alternatives, and they see ASEAN there, and the closest is the Philippines. With the election of a new Taiwanese president also, re-election of a new Taiwanese president, they continued with their policy of southern policy, again, to look beyond China and look at strong democratic allies down south, which is again ASEAN. So there are a lot of opportunities for supply chain. And this pandemic wakes up the Philippines that the service sector cannot drive our economy. Maybe we should really look at the manufacturing sector and look at critical components that we can be part of the supply chain. And I will speak as a strategic consultant. Some of the supply chains are, Apple is doing work here. HP had to deal with the lockdown, helping these companies out. Dell wanted to explore how to get out of China and explore Subic. So there are a lot of possibilities for American companies to look at the Philippines as an alternative to China and also an alternative to other ASEAN countries.
Thank you, Dindo. And then I would just like to add two quick things. In terms of immigration, one of the things I would recommend the Filipino, especially Filipino-American community, that can be reversed immediately. President Trump has increased the cost for the green card, the cost to take the citizenship test. If you want to petition for a Filipino now, you have to take a DNA test and you must pay for it. Expensive. All three of those things can be washed away. What cannot, there will be people who are going to advocate for so-called merit-based immigration. So if that comes up, what is your alternative? Finally, President Trump actually started a free trade agreement talks with Kenya. And that doesn't receive much publicity, but it's going on. So I would not be reluctant if I were the Philippines to, try all things. Why not? Now, the Philippines would have to open its economics much more than some of my Forbes Parks friends would like. But the reality is, this is going on today. Nobody's talking about it because people don't pay attention. They started in January when President Kenyatta came to the White House, and it's still going on discussions. So just food for thought.
But Harry, why would he need a separate free trade agreement with Kenya when there's AGOA?
Those are two different things. AGOA, one of the things is, the reality is Kenya doesn't really meet everything in AGOA. But a free trade agreement does two things. One, specific items from your country and from Kenya and the United States. The United States wants to sell more agricultural products to Kenya. Kenya wants to expand its trade where a lot of its agricultural products right today goes to South Asia to the United States. A wrinkle is the United States is insisting on more Kenyan support for Israel. We'll see where that goes. Kenya actually does recognize Israel. The big thing is, what does this do to Kenya's, the Africa Free Trade Act? But again, this is something that the Kenyans want, and it's very popular. They think it gives them prestige in one way, but it makes some of their will give some of their products access to the U.S. market where you really don't see Kenyan products. You just don't. But my point is not Kenya. My point is, this is going on. Nobody I haven't heard any Democrats criticize the free trade agreement with Kenya. So why not try one with the Philippines?
Do we have any products that enter duty-free into the U.S.? Dindo, would you know?
Sure. Sorry about that.
Any products that enter duty-free now to the U.S.?
I'm not sure for specifics, but it's possible that there are some.
Yes,
we have some preferential treatment, so in some products. So I'm not sure.
Okay,
but it doesn't always necessarily have to be duty-free. It can be less duty, more access.
Yeah.
Some things work and some do not. When I was there, we tried to get, as a counterweight against China, we tried to have Philippine mangoes, which took a couple of years to pass all the sanitary, but it was too expensive for Philippine agriculturists to send mangoes to the United States. So you have to look at everything. But Filipino, when you take the mangoes and make them dried mangoes, the bananas and dried mangoes, those can go in. And why not at a larger market? Philippine textiles have really lost out to China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, as everybody else. That could be someone to come out. But I'm just, I'm just trying to prompt the audience to think tactically and prepare rather than being in a receipt mode. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. Lila, you have to unmute.
Yeah, a couple of quick things. One is, I recall I was working under the Aquino administration. I believe this was 2015, and Noy was very pro Trans-Pacific partnership with Obama, and they did actually examine it and study it because they thought it, and Secretary Parissimo would obviously know more than me, but from my recollection, the problem had to do with provisions in our Constitution, which, I mean, as we all know, you can't have majority foreign share, and it's a problem in a free trade context when you want to open markets. So I know that Duterte did not like the TPP, and his reason was because you would not be able to use generic medications, and that you would have to use brand medications. But I do believe that in terms of a free trade agreement, that has always been a barrier and a source of complaint by many foreign investors. Now, the other thing is, to get back to what Dindo was saying, I mean, I have always believed that we have to get out of being a service-oriented economy, and the Philippines has to go into manufacturing. However, that being said, I will point out that, in my view, having served 3 Philippine presidents and being related to 2, I feel that presidents are basically puppets of economic puppeteers. I mean, the real power brokers in any given context are the people who finance these people and who end up getting the long-term perks, which is why you never got land reform under Cory Aquino, because the landlords were in Congress, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel that our distinction with other countries in the region, in the Asian region, is that our elites are notorious for investing in real estate, luxury real estate, luxury goods, but in terms of domestic industries that would have a downstream effect on employing the poor, it's not necessarily something like, unlike Thailand, unlike India. And being half Indian, I will say that in India, everybody complained about the investment climate in India because of the British bureaucracy was even more arcane than the American bureaucracy left in the Philippines. But non-resident Indians living in Europe and America, despite the imperfections of India's investment climate, had a kind of economic patriotism, and they would keep sending foreign direct investment and other things back to India. And I think that you see the results of that in many ways. And when I was at NDP, we did a study about remittances and how they affect the Philippines. And one thing we observed was that it's really the lower and lower middle income Filipinos who send money back to the Philippines. Once they become elite, they like to call themselves overseas Filipinos and not OFWs. And somehow there's this kind of shame, if you will, about having to support people back home. So I think, yes, we can put it at the feet of Biden and put it at the feet of Duterte, sure, or Trump, or whoever will replace Duterte. But we really are still going to need economic elites in the Philippines and abroad, in the US, for example, to invest in the Philippines so that there isn't so much capital flight. Thanks.
True. Lisa, you brought up a point earlier about the ranking, well, the ease of doing business here, basically. That's it, right? You said there was a survey. Do you want to speak about that a little bit? A survey of foreign investors and the Philippine rankings in terms of supply chain.
Oh, I think that was someone else maybe. I just wanted to bring up a point about climate change, because the Philippines is one of the most susceptible countries to climate change, and we're already seeing a lot of impacts. And obviously, a Biden presidency will bring the US back to the international stage in terms of trying to solve the problem rather than putting their heads in the sand, which is what's happening now in terms of rejoining the Paris Agreement. So I think that's a really critical issue that I hope all the voters in the US and overseas will consider. You know, it's a long-term issue, but we're already seeing all the immediate impacts at, you know, fires in the US and in Australia and the Philippines with, you know, very strong typhoons and storms, and it's becoming, you know, an economic issue that's affecting people, you know, now, and it's going to get worse and worse in the future. It will make the COVID crisis seem like nothing in comparison once we get into, you know, the seriousness of climate change. So I'm really hoping and praying that Biden will be able to bring the US back into really solving this problem and bringing all the private sector and other people who are already working on this issue, but the government really needs to take a leadership role.
Yes, Cindy.
Yeah, I just want to throw something in here because I think it's an important factor in terms of all of these issues, and that the political climate in the United States has changed vastly during this pandemic. I mean, most of you have heard of the Black Lives Matter movement and the defund the police. Well, of lately, that has taken also intersected with the movement to defund war. And so that will impact, while it's just a beginning movement in the United States, it will impact, as well as the economic crisis we're facing here in the United States, it'll impact how much military aid is going to be given out. Will there be cuts? Joe Biden has promised there will be some cuts to military. Now, whether or not it's major cuts or minor cuts, will be up to this movement here in the United States to pressure him. I mean, that's the same with the climate crisis. The movement here and internationally around climate crisis, it really, the Biden administration will be very sensitive to where this movement is. And as well as one of the big reasons the Trans-Pacific trade agreement failed was because of the impact of 20 years of the NAFTA agreement, the one with Mexico and between North Americas and Canada. And that had devastating impacts, not only in terms of jobs in the United States and the decline of manufacturing, as well as the decline of livelihood in Mexico. I mean, that's when Mexicans began to immigrate in great numbers to the United States. Any trade agreement will be scrutinized by the labor movement here in the United States. And Joe Biden is heavily supported by the labor movement here in the United States. And he's got to come up with some solutions, you know, and he does have an economic plan in terms of, as Lila said, the, dealing with small businesses, reviving them, because we know that small businesses in most countries are the backbone of the economy for working people. And so any plan, any trade agreement will be scrutinized here in the United States. And you know, if it's a small agreement with the Philippines to allow certain products into this country to help the Philippine economy, I'm sure Joe Biden will be open to it. But any major trade agreements will be scrutinized heavily here in the United States in terms of its impact on working class people.
I think we can go to some of the questions now. We have a ton of questions here. Should we go to the gossipy ones first before we go to the serious ones? Joe Assad, he's saying, does anyone really believe Trump has COVID, or is he faking it? Okay, Joe seems to think he's faking it. So let's just have a little light discussion, and then we'll go to the other questions.
Well, but that is not a light discussion. That is not a light issue, because that shows you
trust,
how,
obviously,
how people cannot trust what Trump and his administration have to say, as well as what is Fox News? That's the Trump media station. So it's really a very dangerous kind of atmosphere here, is that we cannot trust our president. We cannot trust it in his administration and what even his doctor is telling us. So it's a very serious question that we can't trust our president. So how can he be trusted around the world?
Whereas Biden has been very open about believing the science and trusting the science, right? Yes, Lila.
Hi, Joe. I think that, when I first heard that he had COVID, I was like, oh my God. And then I said, where's the source? And when I saw that he was the one who tweeted it, I was like, oh, that's tactically brilliant. I mean, if at the 11th hour, he's going to disarm the Democrats and get them to fall back on their legendary politeness and grace, which we saw when Biden, was very chivalrous about it. I thought, okay, so he wants to disarm the Democrats and he wants to get sympathy votes. And he probably will. That's really smart. And he doesn't even have to stump now, and he's got an excuse. But then, there were so many sites reporting it. And so I guess it's true, Joe. The one thing I will say is that I thought I was pretty, I'm generally scandalized, but I was pretty scandalized yesterday when he went into his SUV and, waved at people outside of Walter Reed. And his doctor at Walter Reed, Dr. Phillips, was aghast. And he said he's now imperiled all of his security detail in the car, and they're all going to have to be on quarantine for 2 weeks. So it's just, grossly irresponsible. And the fact that he's just gone back to the White House after 3 days in the hospital, and he's just been seen on Twitter and on TV without a mask. Where's the human compassion for others?
Yeah, that's true. But also in the polls, national polls have Biden leading by anywhere between 8 and 13 points, right? Leading Trump by 8 and 13 points. Will, this is from one of our members, Srinivas Polichetti. Will Trump's testing positive impact his re-election, and will it impact positive or negatively? Anyone want to speculate? Although voting is underway, right? So there are a lot of early voters already who've shown up and cast their votes. But yes, Lisa.
Yeah, my view is, I disagree with him trying to do this to get sympathy votes. I don't think he did this on purpose. I think it was just a matter of time that it happened, but I think it'll impact him negatively just because it shows that his attitude about it before was wrong and dangerous, and is continuing. He is continuing to do the wrong thing, like walking, going out for this SUV ride, and it's just, compounding all of his previous actions, which were wrong, and he's continuing to do the wrong thing. So I think that's, I'm glad in a way because he's being consistently wrong. Because, at any moment, through his whole presidency, I kept thinking at any moment he could just turn around and start doing the right thing, and then he'd get more and more support. But he's never done that, which is sad for the country, but it's good for his reelection chances because I think he's just continuing to dig himself into a hole. So I keep digging, and I'm confident that, anyone who's on the fence or, not completely committed to voting for Biden will be swayed by some of these things. But having said that, there are very few people, I think, at this point who are undecided. So for me, it's a matter of getting people to vote, because the more and more people who vote, the more chances Biden has to win.
Well, Cara Wilson is asking if Trump's medical records, are they legally open to the public? Couldn't an official vetted copy of these records dispel any rumors? But I'd like to say he hasn't shown his tax returns, so it's unlikely that he'll release his
But I think his medications are being publicly shared. So I think there is
a ton of comorbidities, right? He's on a whole cocktail of medicine. But yes, Lila.
The absurdity, I agree with you, Lisa, about Trump, but the absurdity of this situation in which we find ourselves is that, for example, in the Philippines, the COVID response has been profoundly problematic on so many levels. And yet you get this, 91% popularity rating from, I think it's Pulse. And I don't know, of course, everyone's going to say how accurate is it? Fine. But the point is, apparently in this moment in history, incompetence and corruption and dishonesty do not necessarily spell unpopularity. And why the dumbing down of the planet? Well, I would attribute that to the fact that we now have so many screens and our attention span is so low. We have collective attention deficit disorder. My nieces and nephews, they don't read a book the way I did when I was 16. They're all like staring at 5 screens at the same time. And perhaps that's why people like these saviors who save you from the burden of freedom to think for yourself and give you pat and easy answers. And that's the tragedy of this moment, I think, is that we're all asking very hard questions, but the majority want easy answers.
Yeah, but also none of this would be happening if there were no enablers, right? No one's actually, well, at least in the Republican Party we've seen, and actually Ninfa Bito raises an important point, like, is there any possibility of any staffers or Secret Service drawing a line in the sand and saying, enough, we will not endanger ourselves to play your game? I don't know. I haven't seen anything. Maybe while we've been doing this, something's come up, or someone else has been, tested positive, but I don't see anyone actually really, standing up and saying something. Whereas in the Biden, so far in the Biden campaign, they seem to be very transparent, right?
Right.
Well, I think what's characteristic about this time is that people in governments seem to be really afraid. It's not like a few years ago where people would, people I know in the White House now, they don't dare to speak up. Just like it is in the Duterte administration, as far as I have observed.
Can we just talk about, I have a question from Luis Leteri. What about Kamala? She's like you know, an important part as well of the ticket. What would that have any appeal maybe for Philam voters, and how would she kind of be pivotal in any way towards policy towards the Philippines, or foreign policy perhaps? Anyone care to weigh in on that?
Well, I think Kamala will be very open to the issues that both her and Biden will put forth and have put forth a more humane immigration policy, as being, I think she's part Jamaican, and so she understands the importance of immigrants to the United States. She understands the contributions and how much money immigrants put into this country. So she will be important to that whole immigration reform that needs to take place. And she has stated that herself. So I think that's a very important, as we've discussed, the Filipinos and the unification of families.
Mm-hmm. Anyone want to add something?
I want to say that one thing that a lot of Asian American and Pacific Islanders keep saying about Kamala Harris, whose background is really interesting because she comes from this very upper caste. Her mother is from an upper caste Indian family, and then her father is Jamaican. But interestingly, although it was her mother who brought her up, and she didn't spend as much time with her father, her mother brought her up to see herself as Black. And, you know, she went to Howard and she thought of things in terms of the civil rights movement. And a lot of, you know, Indians I talk to here, friends of mine, are like, yeah, well, you know, she doesn't really identify as Asian. And that's not really her fault. I mean, it's like, that's how she was brought up. And I guess the onus is on us to kind of bring her in. I think in the beginning I was very worried because she was so obviously pro-Israel. And then, you know, and then a friend was saying, well, you know, if you want to survive in US politics, you have to, you know, I mean, the Jewish lobby is so huge. And I think what has made me feel much more at peace is that, you know, Biden and Harris have said that they want a two-state solution and that they, you know, recognize Israel, they recognize Palestine. So, yeah, I think, you know, despite my initial concerns, I really think Kamala is the mom.
So do you think that Biden would be a one-term president? This is from Michael Kepler, considering his age, and was the choice of Kamala also partly because, you know, to take over should anything happen, and then perhaps, you know, for 2024 run? Harry?
Well, you know, one thing we've seen around the world, when people become powerful, they tend to hold on to it or try to hold on to it. So I wouldn't speculate. Vice President's pretty slim and robust, but I would like to say that, you know, Senator Harris, like many of us who have multiracial, multicultural children, those children are always looking for their identity. And so she tried to find it at Howard University. Same thing with Obama. However, remember, her mother took her to India all those summers. She spent many summers in India. And I think she really understands at least Tamil culture. But more importantly, this is a chance to have a woman be Vice President of the United States whose both parents are immigrants. So she will understand the immigrant experience, the challenge not only her parents had, but her uncles and aunts and cousins in navigating the labyrinth of American immigration law. And so I think she would be open to it, and she'd be a model of what you can do within one generation. Let's remember this, within one generation, she's running for Vice President of the United States. And there were, there were others. Tammy Duckworth, who was Thai American, also was a senator and ran. But let's look at her. It's amazing. It's not just the Asian community. I've seen African Americans say, "Oh, she's not black because X, Y, and Z." So those things happen to my children also. But I would just say, and I know Lila can really identify. You get it from both sides. Let's not kid ourselves. Let's not kid ourselves. But this is an extraordinary woman. But I wouldn't count Vice President Biden out. The last thing is, if you think Duterte is difficult to deal with, Bibi in Israel is extremely difficult to deal with. So I wouldn't expect major breakthroughs initially.
Who would you guess might be the Secretary of State? Because that's obviously another pivotal role in the administration. Do you have any idea who the front runners?
I was surprised by Tillerson. I was surprised by Secretary Clinton. Clearly, my colleague Susan Rice is a candidate. Senator Coons from Delaware, who's a friend of Vice President Biden's, who's a dynamic person. He's traveled all over the world remember this: why I think he might pick a senator, he's going to have to repair relations on the Hill, get funding from the Hill. Because if you can't get funding from the Hill, and you basically have 2 years to do it, then he has to send somebody around the world who is actually personable. He can't make every trip. He really has to be seen as focusing on domestic policy. So that's why it may be a senator, but Susan Rice is quite capable.
Sure.
And I think one of the things they would ask the Philippines about is the Senator Ping Lacson anti-terrorism bill.
How do you think they'd respond to that terror bill?
Well,
which is very controversial.
Well, yes, the United States initially was supporting that in 2014, clearly, but there are aspects of that are very broad. Now, the Philippines is a sovereign nation. It can choose to keep that, but 4 senators in the fall, a couple of months ago, wrote letters of concern about that bill. One congressperson introduced Philippine Human Rights Act, which has languished.
Yes.
I do not know whether it would pass, to be clear, but there would be a lot of asking the Philippines to relook it and maybe narrow it so that freedom of speech is not curtailed in a democracy.
And I would add freedom of the press. I mean, you have the case of Maria Ressa, as well as the shutdown of ABS-CBN. Those are important issues when it comes to how solid is a democracy, because if you have no freedom of speech, no freedom of press, what is that? That's an authoritarian regime. And will the United States, would Joe Biden and Kamala Harris support that? I don't think so.
Yeah, but well, the U.S. is undergoing its own test of democracy at the moment, right? I mean, one
yes,
could
it
say,
is. But right, but that's why we need to turn around and support Joe Biden.
So what
you
about
can't
the
do it
electoral?
under Trump.
There are several questions.
Why Indo said we have to be humble and listen to others. We're not in a position to preach anymore. In many ways, we're in decline. It is a multipolar world. We have to listen, and we can't ignore our alliances or pacts that we previously produced.
I think Biden realizes that, no?
Oh, clearly he does.
Yeah, he does.
And he empathizes with people who've had challenges, because he's had terrible personal issues in his life. So again, I think that, remember when Biden graduated from Syracuse Law School, Wall Street was not taking him. It wasn't just, the personal tragedies he's had with his family. It is that he was not an Ivy Leaguer. He wasn't seen as that. He understands that. He comes from a hard-scrabble middle-class background in Pennsylvania. He really understands the challenges that most of our families face.
But where do you think he'd go if Amy Barrett doesn't get confirmed? Obviously, he'll have one more seat to fill as soon as he becomes president. So any contenders as well?
I don't know who the contenders are, but this is important. Today, we had two things with the Supreme Court. One, South Carolina, they said they could keep their restrictions on mail-in ballots. Then the Alito and Thomas said that the decision allowing gay marriage was incorrectly decided. The Supreme Court can look at that again. There's a suit. So if you get Amy Coney Barrett and they reverse LGBTQIA rights, that won't be the end. Will not be the end.
Well, they want to dismantle Roe v. Wade, right? I mean, they're very...
Unfortunately, we have this organization, FAB here, Filipino American Voters, and even the Republican that we tried to get on to join us tonight, he says if you are not a Catholic unless you not only vote for Trump, that are you anti-abortion, and that all of us who are not should be excommunicated. And the polls show that the Vietnamese are the Asian American group that have the highest support for the Republicans and Trump, followed by Filipinos.
Yeah, but the Vietnamese support is based on a fear of communism, right? That's.
Well, I don't think it's a communist country anymore. It's more authoritarian, which has become fast a military ally of the United States.
Right.
Whereas for the Philippines,
I'll let somebody else talk.
No, I know, but for Philams, I think one of the driving issues is abortion, right? I mean, they historically tend to vote Republican because they're anti-abortion. I mean, it's like a single issue decision, right?
It's still a minority. It's 37%.
Oh, okay.
But it's 52% vote Democratic, so it's 37%. Everybody's entitled to their own views, but I consider myself just as Catholic as them.
But Biden himself, who's a practicing Catholic, has said that
Biden is his roommate.
But also the policies that are historically proposed and pushed by Democrats actually reduce abortion rates. So if anyone wants to reduce abortions, they should support Democrats and support all of the policies that have been put in place that actually reduce abortions. Making it illegal does not reduce abortions. People still get abortions illegally. We have more information on family planning, more support for women, support for girls' education, and support for women's health across the board. We will actually reduce abortion rates.
Just full disclosure, we did ask a couple of Republicans to join the panel, but for the sake of balance, but they declined. And well, we have Dindo here, who's an analyst, so he has to be neutral. We have time for yes. Sorry.
Sorry. Can I just say one thing? I think that the beauty of Biden's position is its nuancing. I mean, he's said, I'm Catholic. I personally don't agree with abortion for me, but I respect I don't feel it's my place to tell other people how to live their lives and make decisions, and I respect their choices. That's one. Number two, Trump pulled out of the UN Population Fund, which is a very serious matter for the Philippines because our worst sustainable development goal in the Philippines, as far as I know, is still maternal mortality. And, that's what conditional cash transfers were trying to change, where, because a lot of Filipino women, they don't die before and during childbirth. They get sepsis the month after they give birth, when they've gone home to the provinces. And they don't avail of health care. And, you know, the lack of support, it's not just a lack of support for abortion, it's a lack of support for reproductive health services in general. You know, it's very bad for the health care of women. And I think what is so great about the gender platform of the Biden-Harris campaign is that it's really very progressive in terms of helping women, poor women, in America and all over the world, stay alive.
That's true. What about the electoral? We have a question here again from Joe Assad asking about the Electoral College. Let's just talk about that. And then I think the overriding concern of a lot of our attendees is the China situation, the West Philippine Sea. But let's just talk briefly about the Electoral College. I mean, you know, the projections are that Joe Biden will win the popular vote, but we saw what happened to Hillary. What are the chances of that happening again this time around? Cindy, you want to say something? Or Dindo?
Well, the Electoral College is just an antiquated system that's left over from slave days, slaveholder days, and to give power to the slaveholders. Now, what I wanted to add in this last discussion is that the United States is undergoing a social crisis, a lot because of the issue of violence against African Americans around police. And this is the longest sustained movement, social movement ever to happen in the United States. There's a lot at stake in this election, not only in terms of the Supreme Court and issues like the right to choose, you know, so, you know, the ruling class and corporations are going to have to see whether or not issues like reversing same-sex marriage, reversing Roe versus Wade, all of those issues can continue to contribute to the growing social crisis in this country to the point of total destabilization. And so that's the other thing about the Electoral College, because if the majority vote, and that's why the vote has to be wide for it to be sustained, and so that the Electoral College vote cannot overtake the majority vote. That's why the battleground states are so important, because those are many of the states that have a lot of the Electoral College votes. So, you know, as I say, there's a lot at stake in this election. And so that's why it's important that everybody get out to vote, vote for Biden and Harris, even though, you know, many people will admit they weren't the first choice, but it's so important that people get out and vote. This is your choice, Trump versus Biden. You don't have a choice for a third party here.
Well, a third party vote would be a vote for Trump, right? In essence.
Right. That's why you really don't have a choice.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. If no one has anything to add, can we move to the China issue, which seems to be preoccupying a lot of people? We have a question here from Michaela Del Callar. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently announced a formal rejection of China's massive maritime claims in the South China Sea, declared support for the Philippines' arbitration victory and smaller claimants, and said the US will not allow China to rule and control the resource-rich waters. Is there a possibility for Biden to retain much of Trump's policies toward China, specifically on the South China Sea disputes, if he wins? Anyone want to weigh in? Dindo, maybe?
Me, from my understanding of policy statements from the United States, I think there's a bipartisan agreement on dealing with China, but something that might actually change is that from a mere transactional approach, which is basically Trump, negotiate, then step backward, then step forward. That's why I raised it earlier in my presentation. I believe taking off from some of the speeches of former Vice President Biden, that he can actually lead the United States in a multipolar world in the region. I'm referring to the Asia-Pacific region. The US calls it the Indo-Pacific, because we don't need China and the US dealing with each other here, but we need countries that have shared values, and the US is one of them, that has shared values in terms of democratic values, a rule-based order that can really generate support from neighbors of the Philippines like Japan, South Korea, to majority of countries in ASEAN, to neighbors like India, to the west and to the east, Australia and New Zealand. So you see, and even maybe Europe would like that kind of regional order in the Philippines. And the Biden leadership might be more supporting a more broadened approach to it and generating a regional grouping of like-minded nations.
Okay, and complementing that question is, this probably encapsulates the whole China issue as well. There seems to be some tension between the Biden campaign's emphasis on human rights and its intention to strengthen partnerships in the region. How do you see a Biden administration balancing those issues in its willingness to speak about human rights concerns in the Philippines, particularly if such comments could complicate or undermine efforts to work collaboratively with Manila on shared threats in the West Philippine Sea? I think, Lila, you talked about it a little bit, but maybe let's discuss it a bit more at this time. Who'd like to?
Yeah, that's why I used the term earlier, shared democratic values, because at the end of the day, that can bind countries together, and human rights is one of those security threats or non-traditional security threats that I try to raise. I believe not only the US, but other friends of the Philippines, nations, neighbors, should always take note of the importance of human rights as a cornerstone of Philippine democracy.
Anyone else have anything to add?
Biden is the only one who has talked about human rights violations in China with the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, you know, and I think that's a very good sign. I think that shows that, I mean, I think this notion of economic growth and people-to-people partnership, that's good, that's great. I mean, we need that, and in a COVID context, economic empowerment is really important. But as I said before, you know, it is a little bit worrisome watching the UN Human Rights Council very, very closely. Any day now, it's going to come out with a statement on the human rights situation in the Philippines. I'm hoping against hope that they don't allow propaganda and whitewashing, and that, you know, we acknowledge that we are less than perfect. And I think that Biden would care more about the poor, frankly.
I think before we close, I think we have room for one more question. Carmen Fernandez is asking about, again, this has been another issue that's been going on, right, since RBG died, about the Democrat response might be to stack the courts, to say they'll add, you know, X number of justices. Is that, how would that affect, if Biden wins and he can stack the Supreme Court and control both houses, how does this affect the two-party system, two-party functioning democracy? Anyone care to weigh in on that? Harry?
Well, Vice President Biden has not answered the question about adding justices to the Supreme Court.
He hasn't said anything, but it's something being floated around as a possible.
Yeah, but he has not. But in the past, he said he would not do that. That
Yes.
you would just lead to tit for tat. So we take him at his word, and we'll have to see what what will happen. But more important is that Judge Amy Coney Barrett is a danger to democracy, to human rights, to women's rights, to gays' rights. Our first priority should be to try to defeat her. Hope that we can. This is a person who had COVID, came to the White House along with others and refused to mask. This reckless behavior, no character. And character counts on the court as well in politics. The biggest thing that the Democrats could do is put the filibuster back in the Senate, which was taken out, to really make control that if and when and one day it would happen, the Republicans come back in. They cannot put unqualified, unreconstructed jurists back on all kinds of federal courts, as we have seen under the Trump administration.
But obviously that was a deal, kind of, the pact to the devil that Trump made with the Republican Party, right? So they look the other way while Mitch McConnell stacks the courts with Republican judges.
Right, but if you had the filibuster, that couldn't happen. Harry Reid made that deal to get President Obama's jurists through, but then the Republicans won the Senate. And so instead of you need 60, now you only need 51. So that's how Kavanaugh got through, and that is how they're trying to get Judge Amy Coney Barrett through.
Well, before we close, anyone with predictions how it's going to turn out? How many Senate seats you think the Democrats would win? How many will they keep the House? I mean, The Economist has it that has posited that the Democrats will still maintain control of the House. I think there's a 99% chance that they will, and then a 67% chance of winning the Senate. And then the polls have Biden up at anywhere from 8 to 13%. So any fearless predictions, anyone, with or without the Electoral College situation? Lisa?
Well, even with the electoral college in place, which it is in place, there's nothing we can do about it right now. I'm confident that Biden will win because, like I said before, it's really a matter of getting the vote out. We're never going to change Trump supporters. Their minds cannot be changed as far as I'm concerned. So Democrats outnumber Republicans, and we just need to get more Democrats out to vote. And from what I've seen so far, lots and lots of people who normally don't vote are voting, both in the United States and overseas. So as long as that can be sustained, more Democrats getting out to vote, then Biden will win.
I'm optimistic, and I have faith. I still have faith that people will take the right stand against the hate that has developed here in the United States under Trump, and the injustice that's been happening at the border of Mexico and with other countries, and compassion for the people that are suffering under the pandemic. And so I have faith in the US public that they will vote right and they will vote for Biden and Harris. But it will be, if they win, it will not be the end. We've got a long way to go to overcome the pandemic. And I think the Senate will be close. So again, that's why everybody that is eligible to vote has to go out and vote for Biden and Harris.
And everybody who knows a US citizen has to encourage them to vote as well. And if they're overseas, go to votefromabroad.org to register.
Okay, can I give not a fearless forecast, but a fearful forecast? My concern is because Trump has said this on a number of occasions, that if he doesn't win, he's not going to step down. So that's kind of like my first fear. And my second fear is a lot of my friends in my generation, both in America and in the Philippines, are exhausted. Kind of compassion fatigue, and are we taking to the streets again? And it's not just, EDSA 1, it's Me Too, it's 99%, it's Gulf, Arab Spring, Prague Spring, Tiananmen Square, and now here we are again. And so I guess what I'm saying is I don't agree with leaving the world to young people only. They are definitely a great hope, but we're not a spent force ourselves, and we all need to realize that this is our battle too. So I would say to everybody, please, the world needs your vote. Thanks.
Indo, I wanted to ask, how would the markets react if Trump actually contests the election and refuses to leave, or, there's a delay in naming the president, in proclaiming the president, it goes to the Supreme Court, say,
I think any uncertainty really will rattle the market, but beyond the market also, it will cause some geopolitical uncertainty. The US being an important player in global politics, given also the reality of we need the world to get their act together, not only with dealing with the global pandemic as a health issue, but also as a security and economic issue. So you just hope that the legitimacy of the election will always be accepted. That means you think that the US, being a mature and claims that, and there's always this commentary that they are a mature and developed country, should respect the legitimacy of its results. So that will create more certainty, not only economic-wise, market-wise, but even security and political around the world at this time of this global pandemic.
Cindy, any fearless forecasts or fearful forecasts?
Oh, I gave you mine. We're going to win.
I'll leave the last word to Ambassador Thomas, who, as one of our attendees, Professor Miroy from Ateneo says, the poster above says it all, hope. So.
Yes, I would like to, first of all, thank you, but this is not only Asian American Heritage Month, it's Filipino American Month. So we congratulate not only the Asian American, but the Filipino American community for all the achievements and all the great things that have come to because of your participation in our democracy. And I hope that you will get out and vote as soon as possible, if early, and on November 3rd for change and hope.
And all of us here can only hope for the best, right? And that the right person wins. For the sake of neutrality, I won't say who that right person should be, but I'm wearing blue, so. Anyway, thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. Thank you, Asia Society, again, for partnering with us. It was a great discussion. Now, all of you in the US, Lila, are you voting? No.
I can't comment.
Can't vote, right. But I guess Cindy, Lisa, and Ambassador Thomas, you're all. I know you're all, if you haven't voted that yet, I know you're going to vote soon. And so thank you for joining us, Manila House members. Don't forget that we've opened our deck, and please come and see us, have a drink, have a meal, and just chill. The weather's great. We hope to see you at the club again soon. And thank you again to everyone. Dindo, we want to see you at the club soon, right? Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. The video will be up in a day or so on the Manila House YouTube channel. And if you'd like to see it, if you'd like to watch it again. Thank you again, and let's all hope for the best, all right? Thank you, good night to our US-based viewers, and have a great rest of the day for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.